Winter veganism doesn't have to leave you cold. You can stay warm without the fur or the down on your Canada Goose coat. We'll tell you how to steer clear of that company's phony marketing tactics and fake ethics. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, why you should avoid Canada Goose products.
Canada Goose has a history of claiming their products are somehow humane and ethical, and they tout various certification programs that sound somewhat legitimate. But when you pull back the veil, even just slightly, it becomes very clear that the claims are meaningless, and that the coyotes used for the trim and the geese's feathers used inside the jackets, those animals still suffer in many of the same ways that they would even if Canada Goose had no standards.
Anne Brainard, PETA's Director of Corporate Affairs, says the fake standards can deceive consumers. The reality is the fur on the trim is cruelly obtained. And don't be fooled that down feathers can be humanely plucked.
Many birds are actually plucked alive. We have found this all over Eastern Europe and in Asia, which is where the vast majority of down feathers are produced. Workers pin the animals down with their hands or sometimes their knees or feet, so otherwise restraining them, and they yank fistfuls of feathers from the birds' delicate bodies. And often this bursts the skin open, and workers are there with a needle and thread to sew up the animal's skin without any painkillers.
I guess it's sort of this indiscriminate way that someone would just grab you by the scalp and try to rip your hair out.
That's a perfect analogy.
Brainard and I talked recently about how it's easy to find the perfect vegan winter coat, as other high-end brands have adopted more compassionate policies. She mentions brands and what consumers can do. But as for Canada Goose, they stonewall PETA, which is why they've been targeted again for their fake ethics and real cruelty. Here's my conversation with PETA's Director of Corporate Responsibility, Anne Brainard, on the PETA Podcast. So, Anne, tell me about Canada Goose. Why is Canada Goose the target again this year? Didn't they do well last year?
No, they did not do well last year. They haven't done well since their inception over 50 years ago. They are an outerwear company out of Toronto. They sell jackets that are trimmed in coyote fur, and these are coyotes who are caught and trapped in the wild. They suffer in traps that mangle their limbs and immobilize them for days. They also stuff their jackets with down feathers, which come from birds who have suffered terrifying and painful deaths.
Well, describe some of that. Describe the fur. How are the animals trapped? And what caught PETA's attention about the way the Canada Goose trapped animals for the fur trim?
Sure. Well, Canada Goose has what they call sourcing standards. But this still allows trappers to use snares. And snares are devices that slowly strangle animals and smash their necks and chests with rotating jaws, as well as steel traps, which are traps designed to crush their limbs and are actually so inhumane that many countries have actually banned them outright.
So why do they still do it? PETA exposed that last year. What happened?
Well, whenever animals are viewed as commodities, corners will always be cut. And in this case, when you're trapping a coyote in the wild, there's really no other way to do it than to use a trap. And you have to imagine a deep wilderness where they lay out these traps, and the trappers are not checking the traps frequently. So animals, after they become ensnared or entangled by the traps, it might take multiple days for the trappers to get back to return to the animals before they bludgeon them to death, or the animals, sometimes succumb just to the elements or perhaps attacks by other predators. The moral of the story here is that there's no way to trap an animal in a humane way. Doing so is objectively cruel and inhumane.
Mm-hmm. And when you do it well, you could, or as well as you possibly can, it could still be days that an animal's trapped and found, and that makes it even worse than it is. It's hard to believe, but
it is very hard to believe. And, their standards still allow these animals to languish with potential broken bones and hemorrhaging for days. We've also received reports of still nursing moms who are desperate to get back to their pups, who have been known to even attempt to chew off their own limbs to escape the trap to return to their young.
And yet, PETA exposed this through several reports last year, and I believe in previous years too. The negotiations began, and there were even protests last year. Didn't it move Canada Goose an inch the right way, or did they just stay put?
Well, we know that our efforts are being heard by Canada Goose, and our hope is that behind the scenes something is happening. We hope that they are genuinely considering making the ethical decision to stop using fur and instead use some of the very luxurious high-end faux furs. And instead of using down to stuff their jackets, they will instead use a high-quality, high-functioning synthetic material that, in fact, can outperform the down that they use, because down becomes completely useless when it's wet, whereas down alternatives retain that warmth and insulating capability even when it's drenched in water. So we hope that our message is being heard, and we hope that we hear soon that Canada Goose is moving in the direction of being a more compassionate company.
Well, as the Senior Director of Corporate Responsibility, you negotiate with them. Do they say anything back to you, like to indicate anything positive, or are they really just stonewalling at this point?
Well, interestingly, they are one of the only companies out there who do stonewall PETA and who refuse to open the door to any sort of conversation, which is one of the reasons that we have chosen them as a target, because the momentum in the retail and outerwear sector is towards sustainability and towards more ethical sourcing practices. And then you have Canada Goose as an outlier. They refuse to engage. They refuse to admit that their practices are egregiously cruel. And they continue their business as usual while hiding behind these meaningless standards that effectively dupe and mislead compassionate consumers.
And that's exactly the reason why, even though some people are regular listeners of the podcast may say, hey, didn't you do something on Canada Goose last year? Well, we did. We have to do it again because they haven't done much of anything to move things forward. So, and it's good to clarify that, because I saw that instead of Fur-Free Friday, PETA was going to have this Canada Goose protest all throughout malls and in America. How successful were those protests this Fur-Free Friday?
Our protests were very successful. They were really well attended. We had compassionate people all over the nation attending the protests, talking to passersby about fur in general and Canada Goose in particular, as well as not buying the down jacket, in favor of a down alternative one. But I would like to point out that over the last year, we have seen some progress by Canada Goose, but it wasn't because they made the decision to be more ethical. It was because PETA filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission conducted an investigation surrounding Canada Goose's misleading claims. And as a result, Canada Goose stopped claiming that its standards, quote, ensure that suppliers don't abuse animals.
Well, this is a kind of a marketing thing that companies like Canada Goose, they do these sort of tactics. They make it sound like they're better than they are. The lawsuit against Canada Goose means that maybe you'll do lawsuits against others, or have other companies been better than Canada Goose in terms of coming forward to say, okay, you win, PETA, a little bit. We'll give you an inch here.
We often file Federal Trade Commission complaints to try to get companies to stop making claims that really prey on compassionate consumers. So when a consumer walks into a store and sees a label that says responsibly produced or humane or ethical, they want to buy a product that is those things. And they're duped by those misleading marketing claims, and they buy it, even though those products were produced in the same way that a conventional product would be produced. So the effect that Canada Goose's standards have on our efforts to get consumers to buy vegan is that well-intentioned consumers walk into a store, they want to feel good about what they buy, they read Canada Goose's claims, and then as a result, they're misled and deceived, and they buy a product that was very cruelly produced.
Which makes them more angry at the company. And then, so maybe things might fall PETA's way with one big effort this year, one big cold snap, you think?
Well, we hope so, but I can guarantee you that we will not back down until Canada Goose stops using fur and stops using down.
Now, you mentioned down, and I haven't really gotten into the down because we were talking about the trapped animals. And by the way, those trapped animals and the fur, it's really just for the trim. It's just kind of decorative. It almost seems like a waste, right? I mean,
Canada Goose uses fur to, trim their jackets. And it's used for decoration. You know, when people are walking down New York City in their Canada Goose fur trim jackets, clearly it's not protecting them against the elements. There is no reason to be wearing a fur garment, whether you're climbing Everest or you are walking the streets of Toronto. In fact, Colin O'Brady, who is the very first person to cross Antarctica unaided, which is like an over 900-mile trek and lasts 54 days, he wore a microfiber jacket with faux fur. So if he can do it in Antarctica unaided, then the general population can do it too.
It's fashion and style, and it's cruelty. That's what Canada Goose is. And, you know, we talked about the fur trim. Now let's get into the down, because people who wear down jackets, they always say, come on, Emil, birds have feathers. They grow them back. They don't miss them. Surely a company that uses down must have a humane way to get down, right? No?
No, not right. Many birds are actually plucked alive. And we have found this all over Eastern Europe and in Asia, which is where the vast majority of down feathers are produced. And in the down industry, what happens is workers pin the animals down with their hands or sometimes their knees or feet, so otherwise restraining them, and they yank fistfuls of feathers from the birds' delicate bodies. And often this bursts the skin open, and workers are there with a needle and thread to sew up the animal's skin without any painkillers.
I guess it's sort of this indiscriminate way that someone would just grab you by the scalp and like try to rip your hair out. Is that sort of akin to that?
That's a perfect analogy. Yes. Experts have said that the pain and suffering that ducks and geese feel as a result of having their feathers yanked out is exactly the same as a human being would feel if their hair were being yanked out of their skull. So
you're in a quiet, dark place with your down jacket, and you can hear the little feathers saying, ouch, ouch, ouch. I mean, it's like, it's torment, right? You're wearing torment.
It is torment, and there's really no way around it. The only way around it is to buy a synthetic product.
And this is my issue, because it seems to me that when people were complaining, you mentioned this earlier, that down when wet is not good down. Down when wet is even lower than down, not good, not warm, and that there was something better. And they came up with it. They came up with this fiber fill, whatever they call it. They put a brand name trademark on it, and they started selling these totally vegan type of winter coats. And I saw them on the market for a while, and down was nowhere. And just over the last, when I got the new catalogs for this winter season, suddenly here are all these down jackets. And what happened?
Well, I think if you look at the statistics, you'll find something vastly different than what you're finding in the catalogs. So if you look over the last 5 years at the U.S. feather and down imports, they've actually declined by almost a quarter.
So could it be that the down lobby is like getting to some people saying, look, because this is what else I'm seeing. I'm seeing in catalogs, people using the polyfiber fill, and instead of, putting up these pristine vegan jackets up for sale, they're desecrating them with down. They're putting down in there and they're mixing them. It's almost like, if the fur trim wasn't bad enough on a Canada Goose, it's even worse that they shun the fiber fill and put down.
Well, I think the companies are just that are doing that are just out of touch. Consumers today want to buy products that really align with their values, and they like innovation. They like the newest thing. And so most companies are realizing that and are wanting to cater to that growing demand for sustainable and cruelty-free products. So they go and they innovate, or they partner with suppliers of down alternatives that do that for their full-time job, like companies like Primaloft or Thinsulate or Thermore.
Yeah, I see Primaloft. I see it all the time. And they, when the big NanoPuff jackets came out, some NanoPuff had down, but some had Primaloft, and there was always that option. And now I see, I almost see some of the catalogs maybe forgetting about the vegan option and moving more toward this. Oh, we have this new and improved down. Now, when they call anything down, I guess it has to be down if they call it down, or even if it's a trademark down, like some kind of never wet down trademark or whatever they call it. You know what I mean when I say that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but by
Sure.
the way, it's okay to have your dogs chime in. They're just cheering you on. I know.
Thank you.
I know they're just cheering you on.
It's my 13-year-old lab who is deaf, so asking her to be quiet doesn't help.
well, we'll put out a Braille version for her. So, all right. So tell me, what happens when, why do these companies do this with, by not maximizing on the Primaloft and then going to, using down?
Well, they're doing two things. They're telling consumers that they're out of touch, because consumers want the cruelty-free products, or they want down and they're too out of touch. But rarely do people want this blend. But secondly, by doing the blend, they are putting off the consumers who do want the vegan products. So it's really not doing much for the company other than sending confusing messages. But I will say that the biggest outdoor retailers like the North Face and Patagonia are all marketing their down alternatives as being as good as down, and in some cases even better. So in the case of the North Face, they have Thermoball, which has been around for several years now. And last year, they actually came out with their new Thermoball line that's 100% recycled materials. So every jacket that you buy is spun from at least 5 plastic bottles that would have otherwise ended up in a landfill. But they market this product as not only being sustainable, but also as being as good as down and better, in that it can still provide the warmth when it's wet. And Patagonia is doing the same thing with Plumafil, where they market it as replicating down. So the biggest outdoor retailers out there understand that innovation is the way of the future and that consumers love it and crave it and love to buy products that are the newest ones on the market and being marketed as something that's premier to what they had in the past that used to be the best.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm for those down replicators. And all right, I just have an Eddie Bauer guide here. I'm not trying to endorse anyone, but but it's confusing because you see something called microtherm, right? And they call it microtherm down. And I'm saying to myself, well, is it down or is it synthetic? And it's trademarked. So I'm wondering, it's got to be man-made, or is it? Is this one of those? And then they have another thing called down light outerwear. And it doesn't say specifically feathers, but it uses the word down. And once again, it's a kind of a confusing marketing move. But what does that tell you? I know your dog is upset by it. I'm clearly upset by it. But what do you think?
Well, it is confusing. But I think what you need to do always is read the labels, because marketing, it can be confusing, and often it's intentionally confusing. So the best thing you can do is read the fine print and find out exactly the components of the product you want to buy. And that's the only surefire way to know whether you are endorsing a cruel product or you're endorsing one that is cruelty-free.
But in this example, First Santa from Eddie Bauer, when they call it microtherm down, that's really confusing, right?
That is very confusing. And I would guess that it is, in fact, down.
Oh, so when they use down, it's down. But when they say something, when they say something is down light, that's down too. But, I think that is the biggest, one of the lies when you go through these things is, and I know a lot of people, because it's getting cold now throughout America, or it has been the last few weeks, they're looking for something warm. They want to make sure they're getting the warmest, but you're saying there are vegan alternatives that are as warm, if not warmer?
Yes, I am saying that. I gave the example of Thermoball by the North Face. It is the warmth equivalent to 600 fill Goose down, which is going to keep you warm in any condition. And then, yes, it has that added benefit of providing you warmth, even if you get it drenched in a river or in a snowstorm.
Tell me, when you're a consumer out there and you're faced with all this and you get mad, do you just call up the CEO of the company, or should they call PETA, or what should they do if they're a consumer and they're mad about this stuff?
Well, they should definitely use their voice to speak up in any way possible. So complaining to store managers, or calling the customer service line, or calling the headquarters and asking to speak to the CEO. All of those send a message to companies that the demand is very high for cruelty-free goods. It's also really important that consumers take the opportunity to educate their friends and family as to why they should leave something on the shelf if it has an animal-derived component to it.
And, that sounds good, but they need some muscle. Shouldn't they call PETA too and be part of some kind of massive class action?
Well, we are happy to hear complaints, and a lot of times we do act on them. We learn so much from our supporters and letting us know what companies are up to, whether they're being misled. Whatever is happening out there in the marketplace, we want to know about it. So we definitely want people contacting us. But I will also tell you and all the supporters to rest assured that we are in contact with every major retailer out there. And we are urging them to support more cruelty-free products and practices. So, we're doing our work too, but we always welcome the help from supporters.
Now, as the Senior Director of Corporate Responsibility for PETA, that means you are in there negotiating. What are these negotiations like? Because ultimately, you and I know that it's going to be the marketplace that decides. And if the marketplace pushes them in the right way, they're going to go the right way. But how compassionate are these people that you have to negotiate with?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's a spectrum, and on one side, it's consumer demand, and on the other side, it's corporate responsibility. And I think you're only going to see meaningful progress when you have support from both ends. So you need consumers really voicing their concerns about various products or their demand for cruelty-free ones. And you also need companies to be the responsible corporations that most of them claim to be, and to really take action that align with their mission statements and with their stated objectives or milestones or benchmarks that they've set for themselves. And in today's market, most corporations are willing to have conversations about how they can do better and what they can do to really appeal to the compassionate consumer base, now millennials and Gen Z as the largest consumer base in history. Companies want to cater to them. So not only are they capitalizing on it financially, but they're doing better for animals. They are doing better for our planet by eliminating the animal agriculture footprint. So it's a win-win as long as they're open to the conversation. And I would say that most of them are.
And are there some companies that you would say are better than others? And you're clearly targeting Canada Goose because they're not one of those companies. But are there some companies that are better than others?
Absolutely. I think there are dozens and dozens of companies out there that are making progress, that are introducing more vegan options and eliminating some of the cruelest ones. All of the major retailers out there need to do more, though. We're pleased with them taking steps, but we continue to push them to do more, because when you are a massive retailer and you have thousands of different SKUs and thousands of different suppliers, there's going to be cruelty inherent in your supply chain. And so we just encourage companies to take steps to address it. And it might be one material at a time, or one vegan collection at a time. But when you think about the scale of these companies, those small steps are huge when you consider the impact that it has on animals.
And then what about just a company getting a call from PETA? That must mean something. I mean, they don't want an action alert and getting a million emails, right?
That's right. They try to avoid that, and we also try to avoid it. Our goal is always to work behind the scenes with companies and try to identify ways where we can play a consultant role and try to get them to move towards more compassionate products. But sometimes that doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, but you can even get to the point where you say, you have a perfectly vegan shoe, and then you throw a little suede on the heel, and suddenly it's not vegan on a hiking shoe. And it seems like some companies, they'll put out their vegan products, and then they'll keep the hardcore. This is leather. This is nubuck, which is leather and not vegan, or this is something else with a leather trim. And so they're playing both sides. But that's kind of, there's this one shoe company that I patronize, and I buy their vegan shoes. But when they put out these leather shoes that I can't buy, I feel a little like maybe I should look for another pure company. Is there any way? I guess that's a balance, right? That's a corporate balance, right? They're being responsible on one hand and being greedy and cruel on the other hand. Is that the best for some companies?
Well, it's definitely a balance for consumers to try to figure out which companies to support and which to not support. But I would say that when companies have vegan options and you want to buy them, you should buy them, because it sends the message to companies that there is a demand for those products. And if they see that demand, they want to capitalize it, and they'll grow those options. But you have to draw the line in the sand somewhere. And certainly you don't want to support a company like Canada Goose, where they're doing nothing to improve the lives of animals.
Well, that's this year's campaign again, focused on Canada Goose. At some stage, it's you got to admit it's a little like Sisyphus pushing that rock up the hill. It seems hard. You're waiting for that moment when things are going to break for you, and maybe they'll say, okay, we'll take away half the fur trim or whatever. But what keeps you going and keeps you motivated about your job? Are there enough positive signs that say, hey, things are going the right direction for the animals?
I feel that every day. There are small victories that keep me going every single day. And then it's also trickled in there very big victories. So I stay motivated every day because I do see corporations doing the right thing. And that's what keeps me motivated. We also work among other people at PETA who are very motivated and are so dedicated to the cause and to our mission that they go to work every day with their head held high, working very hard with the same goal in mind.
Yeah, also I know there's some personal origin stories that people have that keep them focused on their eye on the prize, as it were. And I was reading something that PETA put out to the Augustus Club where you talked personally about how you came to animal rights, and you talked about a bird you saw as you had a bird as a young girl. Was it a family pet?
Mm-hmm. It was my pet, and I was what I thought an animal lover, and we would go to the pet store and I could pick out any animal that I wanted, and we'd bring the animal home and try to care for it in the best way we knew how. Of course, in hindsight, the animals were suffering and all eventually died quickly after I homed them. So yes, that's how I came, I think, to understand that whenever you are benefiting at an animal's expense, there will be tremendous suffering, even if you think you are well-intentioned.
Well, what happened? There was a time when you were 10 years old. What happened that day that was this, a special memory?
Sure. So we had brought a bird into our house, and he was in the cage, and I would leave the room and I would hear the bird flying back and forth in his tiny cage. And clearly the bird was in distress, and I could hear it from the other rooms in the house. And I would go back into the room, and then the bird would be completely still. And then I would shut the door and leave again. And I would hear that same smashing back and forth. The bird was flying from side to side, crashing into the wire sides of the cages. And one time when I re-entered the room, the bird had died, had hit himself on the cages so many times, and was laying on the bottom of the cage dead. And there was blood splattered all around the cage. And I think it was then that I realized that I wasn't actually saving these animals, that if I really loved them, I wouldn't be holding them in cages. And it was then that I sort of adjusted my thinking and philosophy about animals, even though I was so young. It took me a while on my journey to become vegan. But eventually I got there, and I do think back to that day when I found the bird at the bottom of his cage. And I do think that was sort of a turning point in my life to realize that we have a responsibility to protect animals in any way that we can. And it can start as young as 10 or younger. But as long as you get there and you realize that we all have ownership over our lives and we can make decisions, and we vote with our dollars, and we vote on these issues every single time we buy something or we put something in our mouths or buy a skincare product for our body or makeup for our eyes. We are voting with those decisions.
So you think about that bird a lot?
I do, every once in a while, when we don't have a lot of victories to tout, or you just kind of wonder, am I making a difference? And you think back to that one scenario where it was just that one bird that I needed to help and I couldn't. And I think it helps you understand that you don't have to help all the animals in the world, even though you wish that that were possible. If you can just help one animal, then that's enough.
And I guess if you can, well, if a person listening doesn't buy a Canada Goose jacket, how many animals do they help?
Well, they're helping a coyote, and they're helping several birds that are used for just one jacket. I think if you go vegan, then you save over 200 animals a year. So every time you shop, if you opt for that vegan clothing item or vegan meal, then you are helping a tremendous amount of animals cumulatively over your lifetime.
Tell me about the standards. Why are the standards? They set they set the bar high, which allows them to get away with a lot of these minor cruelties, which are really major tragedies to the animals. Tell me about the standards and why the standards are an issue.
So Canada Goose has a history of claiming their products are somehow humane and ethical. And they tout various certification programs that sound somewhat legitimate. But when you pull back the veil, even just slightly, it becomes very clear that the claims are meaningless and that the coyotes used for the trim and the geese's feathers used inside the jackets, those animals still suffer in many of the same ways that they would even if Canada Goose had no standards. And it really insults consumers' intelligence that Canada Goose attempts to convince us that fur and down can be produced humanely. And consumers rely on the truth in labels. And these marketing schemes really betray the trust of the public and mislead these consumers into thinking that the products were more humanely produced than those produced conventionally. And there's a lot at stake these days. It's our health, it's the planet, workers' rights, and of course, animals. And each of us and every company really has a responsibility to align our actions with our values. And so every time you take out your wallet, you're voting, make sure to check labels. And if something is animal derived, leave it on the shelf. And don't be duped by these marketing schemes.
Where do the standards have to go? I mean, how to make an impact? Do you have to say, is there a line that would be the clincher that would say, okay, now we have to do this, or we had a little loophole before, but now we have to do it this way?
If their standards required that they only use vegan materials, they would be standards that consumers could rely on. There's no standard out there that will ensure the humane treatment of animals because there will always be loopholes, corners will always be cut, and no amount of auditing or company assurances can eliminate the suffering on farms that will happen when people aren't looking or when people just turn their back because they don't care enough.
But it means that if there's no absolutes, how do we know? How do we know that we're getting anything that is close to this vegan ideal that we want?
Well, what is the vegan ideal is vegan materials. So check labels, and if you see an animal-derived composition, don't buy it.
When you say an animal-derived composition, you mean?
So when you check the label on a garment, it will list what materials are used to produce it. So it might say cotton or wool or fur. So if it has anything listed that comes from an animal, you should recognize and understand that it was produced with animal suffering involved. And there's no way to get around that. On an industrialized farm, in order to fulfill the demand in a commercial space, there will always be suffering.
And there's nothing anyone can do about that, huh?
The only thing you can do is buy vegan products. That is the only way to ensure that you are not supporting cruel industries.
Well, that's pretty plain. I mean, and you can't fight that. You can't fight that going into a negotiation and say, hey, come on, guys, give us some vegan products. They won't do that. They won't put that line in the contract saying vegan materials, right?
Well, I think companies that are ethical and are responsible are doing that, are creating vegan products and vegan collections and adding search filters to their website that indicates vegan products. So they're trying to make it easier on consumers because they realize the demand is there. So our work is to push companies to do more of that and to reduce with the goal of eventually eliminating all of their animal-derived products.
Anne Brainard is the Senior Director of Corporate Responsibility at PETA. Thank you for joining us on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you.
Anne Brainard, PETA's Senior Director of Corporate Responsibility, and why Canada Goose remains a target for the cruelty inherent in their winter coats. By the way, Anne joined us with her dog, the 13-year-old Labrador. You know, we don't edit that stuff out. You know, the podcast is for the animals, too. Hey, join in the protest of Canada Goose. Go to PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on aldef.org/blog, that's AALDEF.org, or AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. You can check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.